Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Supporting Teachers and Parents of Students with Special Education Needs with SEL During the COVID-19 Pandemic. My name is Linda Torr with the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our presenters. Let's start with Chris Cipriano. She is the Director of Research at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence and Research Scientist at the Yale Child Study Center. Next, we have Gabbie Schlichtmann, the Executive Director at EdTogether and lecturer at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Before I turn it over to our presenters, I just want to remind everyone to add questions to the Q&A box, and I will have our presenters address them at the end of the presentation. Please reserve the chat function for our interactive portion of the presentation. Please note that a recording of the webinar will be sent out to all registrants within 2 business days. And without further ado, Chris Cipriano, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. It's really wonderful to be here today. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. You've gotten to learn a little bit about us. We'd love to know more about you. Let us know in the chat box where you're calling from. Gabbie and I are actually both joining from our respective homes in Boston, Mass. So where's everybody else joining from? Looks like we've got great representation from across the country. Oh my goodness. Wonderful. Thanks you all for taking so much time out of your busy schedules to join us. Wow. Let's also take a moment before we get started this afternoon to reflect on how we're feeling. For those of you who've been trained in the ruler approach, the YCEI's approach to social and emotional learning, you may be familiar with our mood meter. The mood meter helps us to identify our feelings and is rooted in decades of research to build emotional awareness of oneself and of others. So how are you feeling today? Tell us in the chat box if you're willing to share, or take this as a private moment of reflection. In the interest of visibility, I'll share. Right now, I'm feeling pretty excited to be here with all of you. I'm feeling very grateful to be a part of this tremendous learning community. Gabbie, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling really excited to be here today with everybody. It's making me have sort of an open heart to this space. So thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thank you. And I very much appreciate the willingness to be so vulnerable and share across our chat box. And we do want to mention that Gabbie and I will be, with Linda's support, taking all of the information that's shared across the chat box today, including the resources and strategies that folks may contribute, and making that available to you all after the webinar. So we'll be following up in the coming week with that information as well. Thank you very much for checking in and sharing. So, for parents and teachers of students with special education needs, this unusual and atypical time in our collective lives has moments that may be more familiar to us than to most people. Maybe you felt this way too. Many of us already know how long a minute feels. Many of us also know how even the smallest disruption in our routines can cascade into physiological responses and behaviors that undermine the present day and the days to follow. We know loss. We know loss of social experiences. We know what it feels like to be going at it alone. We know aggression. We know disappointment. We've seen extreme mood swings. We know the sleeplessness, the difficulties acquiring medication. And we know the attention and the communication that's required to navigate our students' care teams, the kind of coordination among our teachers, our therapists, our parents, and our peers. We know, unfortunately, what social isolation feels like. We know what it feels like to live under a veil of ambiguity. And as a result of these experiences, we also know how to be flexible with our expectations of our world and the demands it places on us to support our students.
And yet, even in that context where we have all this knowledge and we understand, this still felt like a huge change. and lots of questions and confusion about how is this going to happen? How am I going to move my practice? So as a part of my work, I've been really blessed at this time to get to work as a part of the Educating All Learners Alliance, which is a group of over 40 disability and equity organizations that are working to pull resources together and case study examples to help educators who work with students with disabilities to thrive in this time. And as a part of that work, I've actually been doing the case study work. So I've been able to reach out and talk with lots of educators, and the kinds of questions that were coming up right at the beginning of that effort were things like, can my most vulnerable students tolerate distance learning? Can best practice be translated to this way of educating? How can distance learning be accessible? How can I possibly meet IEP goals under these circumstances? Will we ever catch up for time lost?
There's been this dominant conversation that Gabbie's mentioning here about, over the past 6 weeks, that for me, as an educator and as a parent, it's ringing in my ears. How do we make up for the time we lost together? This question is resulting in a conversation that is frankly misguided and combative. We are challenging you today to move this conversation from the questions, from this question to a mindset of hope and to progress. We challenge you to think, how might we make the most of this time we have together? How might we, in the words of the Secretary of Education when she was addressing the questions of IDA waivers on Monday, with ingenuity and innovation and grit, continue to faithfully educate every one of our students? How do we make the most of this time we now have together? We contend that we must look to social and emotional learning. SEL provides us with strategies and tools that we need to embrace this challenge together. So in today's webinar, we're going to define SEL, but we won't spend a lot of time on it because we really want to identify these opportunities to lean into SEL and promote the well-being of ourselves and our students, and spend most of our time talking about strategies that you can adopt right now in your homes, with your students, with your parents, so that we can get through this time together. So SEL is an interrelated set of cognitive and affective and behavioral competencies that we believe underscores our capacity to learn. It helps to develop and maintain these mutually supportive relationships and for us to be healthy, both physically and psychologically. The goal of SEL programs are to cultivate the development of largely what's considered to be 5 competencies. You may be familiar with the 5 model from CASTLE: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. There is a tremendous burden to succeed weighing very heavily on all of us right now, heavily on our hearts and heavily on our minds. It's really a daunting reality. There's evolving requirements for distance teaching and learning. We're simultaneously supporting all of our students and all of our families, managing waves of loss on a scale that's unmanageable, all while under a veil of not knowing what's going to happen in our future. The worst thing we can do for our teachers, for our students, for our families is deprioritize SEL during the pandemic. It is next to impossible to expect teaching and learning and family functioning to occur in a crisis without attending to our emotions. So we know that chronic stress impedes executive functioning and memory through the prolonged release of stress hormones like cortisol. If we don't manage our stress effectively, it can undermine our ability to be effective learners, teachers, and parents, and it can result in burnout. Further, all of our relationships, they look and they feel very different right now as a result of social distancing and remote education. So teachers are more reliant on parents than ever before as partners in instruction, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. Students and teachers are interacting in a very novel digital environment, and families are spending more time together than ever before. We're on week 6 here with my family. Dysregulated emotions can inhibit healthy relationships during this time, between teachers and their students, among teachers and their students' families, and between members of our own family. If we do not manage our emotions effectively right now, we will not be available to teach, to learn, or to parent. And lastly, When you're overwhelmed, it's difficult to make good decisions. And living through a pandemic requires a healthy mental flexibility that is best accessed when we are experiencing a more positive emotional state. The ability to regulate unpleasant emotions as well as to experience more pleasant emotions have demonstrated health benefits across our lifespan, including fostering greater resiliency during and after a traumatic event. More important now than ever before that we lean into SEL.
So we want to hear from you about the current challenges that are faced by teachers and parents of students with special education needs. So please add 1 or 2 thoughts to the chat. And just as a reminder, we're using the chat to learn from each other. So we'll be collecting your responses that you provide throughout the webinar today, and curating them and sending them back out to you so that you can see if resources or ideas come up through the chat. So please add your thoughts about the current challenges that you are facing.
Wow, I can see an overwhelming amount of activity in the chat right now. So I look forward to getting to review as people are sharing all of the challenges that they're facing. I have 4 children, one who has diagnosed special needs, and it's certainly been a tremendous amount to navigate on the education side and on the parent side.
I'm feeling that too, Chris. I have a son with reading challenges who's in kindergarten. It's been an adventure for sure. All right, great. Let's move on. You all can keep adding things to the chat. Again, we'll be reviewing that later. So as I mentioned earlier, I've been doing work to canvass and collect information from educators as a part of the Educating All Learners Alliance. And through that work, we're consistently seeing 4 themes that come up that educators and parents are dealing with. So the first is loss of services and support. The second is issues of accessibility in this new distance learning framework. The third is time, and the fourth is evolving requirements. And we're going to address each of these today with strategies from an SEL perspective. But really, where do we begin is the question. So before we dive into this, what we want to suggest is that there is so much about this situation that feels completely out of our control. But we want to suggest to you today that the key to a healthy emotion regulation through this time is to anchor yourself first on what you can control. And then in that context, leverage the science of emotional intelligence to work through these areas effectively together. So what can you control? That is the big question. And so I think the first big thing that you can control, Chris and I went back and forth about this a bunch, is your mindset about learning, your own learning, and how you're orienting to your students and families during this time. When I work with educators around creating inclusive learning experiences, I use a framework called Universal Design for Learning, which many of you may be familiar with. But under this frame, this sort of key anchor idea is that we must shift from seeing individuals as disabled and instead think of how design learning environments are disabling. So for example, I'm a person with dyslexia, and when I was in 8th grade, I could only read at a 3rd grade level. And so in my science class, if it had only been presented through live lecture and paper books, that learning would have been inaccessible to me. Rather, if it's anchored to inquiry and project-based learning, if lectures are recorded and the content is provided in alternate formats, if the text is rendered digitally, I can learn right alongside my peers. The paper book in the live lecture is disabling. And it has struck me in going through this situation with all of the educators that I work with that the current move to distance learning is quite disabling to many of us, the shift to this context. Whereas before we felt competent, connected, and in control of our practice. And being able to support our learning. We're now confused, disconnected, and maybe unsure about how to move what we're doing into this new space. But in reality, there are opportunities to take control of our experiences and outcomes and to reconnect with our colleagues, our students, and our families in new and exciting ways. And that is when innovation happens, right? That is a super ripe space when you're persisting, embracing a challenge, looking at things in a new way. And maybe for the first time, we have the experience of what it's like to be disabled by a learning environment in the way we think about it from UDL. So for the rest of this session, we invite you to try and check your mindset about whether you are thinking about growth and learning in this space, and using that as something, as an anchor to something that you can control as we go through these strategies and ideas that we have for you today around our challenges.
Absolutely. So let's start with the first challenge. So our students have lost their services. This challenge can, if we think about our mindset, present an opportunity for us to innovate within and across our relationships and our networks. Yes, our students have lost their services as we once knew them, but how can we advocate and access the resources we need to service our students now that they must necessarily look and feel different? Many educators and providers have been innovating with novel service delivery models through telehealth, web-mediated platforms. And it's actually quite funny. The EdTech community is all ears right now to build what it is you need to be successful during this time. This is the time to speak up and say, hey, there is no way for us to reach this student or that student. This is what we need, because they're ready to build it for you. And although we are all existing at a distance physically, the advocacy world around us of students with learning differences has mobilized in absolutely amazing ways to create and share curated tools and strategies and tips and practices to support students with disabilities online. I have found it to be, to move from this situation of feeling so very isolated to so very connected across the globe in this manner. And at the same time, we can look across our networks, and we also can leverage and deepen our relationships with each other. And this is the first key we want to drive at, thinking about our relationships of what we have here. So educators are our point of contact between families and resources, services, and policies. But parents right now, they are necessary partners. We are partners in this. We must co-teach. We must leverage all the people in our school buildings, in our families, to support our students in their learning. We can be and are the connectors across the distance. And a set of evidence-based practices specific to strengthening the relationship among educators working with students with learning differences comes to us from the Relate project and starts with the promotion of solidarity. So the Relate framework for classroom interactions was developed and tested by my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Tia Barnes, and I and our colleagues at Yale, working alongside educators and paraprofessionals serving students who primarily fall below the threshold for mainstream inclusion. So currently considered a Council for Exceptional Children high leverage practice for self-contained settings. When we think about our current remote learning setup for all of our students, it could be useful to leverage what we know works when there are at least 2 adults with varying levels of authority and autonomy who must necessarily interact with one another in support of their students' education. And in many ways right now, we are all essentially in a self-contained learning environment. So what did we find from this research? Well, we must promote solidarity in our interactions with one another. So you know what solidarity is. It's the consistent presentation of teamwork among teachers, and in this case, among teachers with parents. It is important that the solidarity is visible, however, to your students and all of your students, especially as we're at this distance time. We cannot and we should not give our kids the language or the opportunity to undermine our authority as co-responsible for their learning right now. Teachers and parents can demonstrate this solidarity to their students by keeping classroom rules and procedures as consistent as possible. Regardless if the teacher is present, the parent is present, or both is present. So like create the classroom rules and keep them consistent throughout your learning together. And that means that both the parent or caregiver and the teacher are sticking to those rules. Another strategy that works is making solidarity visible to your students is to use we language when speaking with your students, to reiterate that you are united in your directions and decisions that you're giving to your student. So even from a distance, we can all use we instead of me in an effort to make your collective commitment to your student visible. Learning from classroom science suggests that solidarity promotes consistency in teaching, and it undermines our attempts by our students to challenge our authority, right? Just like they do if you're in a co-parenting relationship at home and one parent gives one direction and the other parent undermines them, likely unintentionally. This can be very problematic because your students can end up pitting one against another. We don't want to give them the language. We want to show them that we are a united front and in solidarity, valuing and in support of their education and their educational experience. You can learn more about the specific set of strategies at therelateproject.com. So far we've discussed one pathway through SEL to support overcoming the challenges of loss of services, and we want to take a minute to learn from you. What is one way? Now again, adopt that growth mindset. One way that you and your colleagues are working to address this challenge right now. So how are you thinking flexibly about service provision for your students? So we'll take a minute to collect in the chat. And I haven't been able to keep up with it, but it does seem like there's been a lot of activity in the chat. So I'm very excited for us to get to cull through this and share out with folks. Wonderful. Seems like there's a lot of ways that we're thinking innovatively on how we can find ways to use services. I am seeing a lot of video chat or Zoom that's popping up across the screen, but I know there's a lot of other things that are happening there for check-ins and team meetings. And feel free throughout our time together this afternoon to continuously use the chat to drop in tips or hints or strategies or something that's worked well for you, because again, we will be sharing these out with everybody thereafter.
Great, thank you, Chris.
All right, let's move on to the next one.
So the second challenge that we want to address today is thinking about this issue of how remote learning feels inaccessible for my students. The reality is that there's never been more a time in our collective history when we've had a spotlight shine so brightly on the inequities that result from an inaccessible education. In part because accessibility issues feel exacerbated for those students who had accessibility issues before in the live space, and also because, as we said earlier, there's this disabling experience of shifting to this totally new environment where there are accessibility issues for so many more of us. Remote learning presents challenges to our entire population of learners, from lack of resources and technology, internet, paper, printers, and learning materials, to inaccessible literacy, auditory or technological capabilities to access content, physical, motor, attention, or memory barriers to succeed in these contexts. How many of you have difficulty attending during Zoom meetings where you didn't have difficulty before in live session? There's something about this space that just makes it much harder to be able to have focused attention. But what we want to say to you today is that we're really seeing a hopeful message that's rising in the wake of this time where we're moving instruction to online. And that is that teachers are implementing strategies that are grounded in universal design for learning and in other inclusive approaches, and it's working for their learners. So our remote learning climate requires innovation towards accessibility in ways that could really inform the transition back to the live environment in ways that are super exciting to me. So for example, I was working with this one school, and a teacher in the second grade who was in the middle of a narrative writing, this is a general education teacher, was in the middle of a narrative writing assignment that they had just finished, and they were about to share their stories with each other and then give each other feedback when they had to move instruction to home. And I consulted with her and coached her through how she might use a technology called Book Creator that included voiceover. And she was like, how am I going to teach my students to do this? They haven't used this technology before. So we walked through explicitly and systematically teaching the students how to use this technology remotely, supporting the parents to do so. It took her probably, I would say, a week, maybe a week longer than it would have taken her to do this exercise in the class. But then at the end of that time, she was visibly shocked in our conversations, noting that all of her students who had individual education plans and would have needed more, typically in the face-to-face setting, would have needed more explicit support, one-on-one support, were able to be quite independent. We reflected together why that happened. And in fact, we had used a lot of strategies that special educators would have used one-to-one, right, with those students by explicitly and systematically teaching with support, providing references at home for students to use in order to do the share, and the voiceover, which allowed students who had low reading or writing ability at the second grade level to communicate their narrative to their peers, which created a greater sense of community. So I'm seeing examples like that all over the place, where these sort of moments of insight about what it means to truly have an accessible gen ed environment, how that transforms relationships. And what I want to say about this is that it's actually a social emotional strategy that we're leveraging to make this happen as educators. We are using empathy as a tool. And what that means is that we take an inquiry stance to the situation. We embrace our curiosity, and we use feeling as our best formative assessment. When students are under-resourced and over-challenged and feeling frustrated or feeling anxiety, that tells us something about the way the environment is designed and their personal experience or perception of that environment, that allows us to enter into a conversation about what might be better for that student, right? So taking this approach to inquiry, giving permission to feel, to have conversations about feeling, will give you information about how your students are doing, when those touch points are now so much more important, because we're not in the building together. We can't just turn and have a conversation. We have to be really intentional about that. Connect often and in many ways. I have been encouraging the educators that I work with to put touch points at the end of every assignment, where they're asking students to just, as a part of an exit ticket, reflect on how that assignment went for them, just in very short form, to have moments of connection, one-on-one connection in the day, or a small group connection, where you might end a Zoom session early and have kids stay later. You can have a small conversation. Just increase those touch points, because you have to be intentional about making them happen. Using conversations and inquiry, I call it the 5 whys. We so often jump to solutions right away, but when you're asking a student about how something's going for them and you're trying to understand their experience, right, which is the basis of being able to design an accessible learning experience, instead of reacting to their first response, keep asking why. Why was that? Tell me more about that, and try to do it 5 times, even if you think you have the answer, because you'll get to more, I promise. And finally, going through this process of ideating with your peers, connecting with other educators to come up with ideas relative to the struggle students are having, implementing, and then seeing that as just another step in this inquiry process where you're evolving your practice. And this really is an empathy-driven practice. Okay, so we want to hear from you about how you are responding to this issue of accessibility in the chat.
Gabbie, I really loved how you laid that out. Empathy as a strategy. So.
Well, it's interesting. I've been doing a lot of thinking, right? Because as someone who works on universal design, you get into schools, you hear from teachers, it's just another acronym, right? Like the alphabet soup of all the different acronyms, culture responsive teaching, SEL, UDL, it's just another thing. But when you look across all of those different models, they all begin with empathy. Empathy as a practice by which you inquire, you are curious, and you really try to relate to and connect with students about their experience.
Looks like we've got a tremendous amount of activity here of folks jumping onto that point about empathy, as well as sharing more about how they're thinking flexibly and creating access points in this distance environment. So very excited for us to be able to go through and call these and share them out. And it seemed as though already folks have found and learned something new. I did, Gabbie, see a couple of questions that popped up just specific to the technology you mentioned when you were sharing that example from the second grade. What was the name of the technology again? Could you share that with us?
It's called Book Creator, and there's actually on the, if you go to educatingalllearners.org, under Voices from the Field, there's a case study describing how that teacher designed that lesson and all the resources she used and links to all of the technology that she used.
Wonderful, thanks. And everyone, we will be sharing out a set of resources that will accompany the recording to this webinar, and we'll make sure to have a direct link in there as well to the case study Gabbie's mentioning. Awesome. All right, let's move on to the third challenge here. And again, feel free to continue to use the chat liberally. So challenge 3, our students have lost so much time. As we said from the beginning of today's conversation, we must shift this conversation to how can we make the most of the time that we all have together now? Because every week, every day, every hour, every minute counts for each one of us, and it's ours to own. My son with special needs has a regressive diagnosis and regressive condition, and it pains me when I hear people in the education space talk about making up the time later, making up the time after we return to school, as opposed to thinking about what that means and what life means in every day and every hour and every minute of our interactions. Because as educators, we know that we can find teachable moments in everything around us, and we need to leverage that. We know that for our students, especially those with our complex diagnoses, even those who are most mild of diagnoses, that the loss of time and loss of services can have a loss that is exponential for our students in terms of what they and how long it will take them to gain back. We need to meet this challenge with a commitment to innovate together and distill our lessons and goals at their core and act on them. What are the creative ways that we can attend to one another? How can we help to promote access? We must work together to meet the challenge, and we must do so with a unique attention to each of our learners and their unique needs and goals. There is absolutely not one size solution here. There never has been in special education, but there is an endless opportunity to innovate together. And we can make the most of our time by promoting a shared positive emotional climate for learning to occur. So an evidence-based practice that you can do right now is promote a shared emotional climate. So in SEL, the emotional climate is understood as the feelings and emotions that a learning experience invokes through the interactions typically talked about between teachers and students. So at the YCI, we work with teachers across the country. Many of you may be engaged with Ruler with us to support in building what we call an emotionally intelligent charter. And this was to promote and sustain a positive emotional climate in your classroom and school. Now, this charter, it's a living document. It reflects how the classroom or school community wants to feel during their learning and interactions with one another. And, you know, it's really interesting, putting your words in and our feelings, putting them in writing is a very powerful way to help to support our emotional well-being. Acknowledging how we want to feel, and that's often different than how we're currently feeling, and then committing to one another in a visible way what we're going to do as a learning community to promote these feelings is a very productive step that we can all take to create a positive emotional climate in a remote instructional practice. So it's not, it doesn't matter that we're not in our class buildings. It's about the essence of emotional climate is the interactions between us and how they will promote our positive well-being, how they will promote us to be in a space where we're available to teach and available to learn. And so we can do that in a distance learning environment. So let's take a quick minute to kind of think about how to build this. If you wanted to go ahead and build an emotionally intelligent charter with your teachers, with your parents, with your co-teachers, your colleagues around you, with your students during this time. So together with your students, start by asking how you want to feel during the remote learning experience. Let each person share their feelings on how they want to feel. And during this conversation, you may also want to speak openly with your students about how these feelings and how they want to feel are different than how they may be feeling right then in that moment. The goal is to have about 5 feelings that are like your top 5 of your classroom, of your class. So these are some examples from my own family's homeschool charter that we set up as we went through this process. So we chose respected, connected, valued, challenged, and supported. Next, we want to discuss what you need to do for each other to feel this way. So maybe we need to set an expectation for how frequently we'll be expected to respond to emails or to questions from each other because we're engaging over this digital space. Maybe we can commit to be present during our instructional time. And what does that mean? What does that look like? What is that expectation? Or we can commit to communicating when we are frustrated, when we are experiencing a positive emotion as well. Wherever possible, think about incorporating your students' current social and emotional goals into the building of an emotionally intelligent charter. And make sure that each of you, so the teacher, the student, the parent, or caregiver, sign the charter. And note that this charter, it should be a living document. You should revisit it as you transition and evolve over your remote learning time together. Relatedly, I did want to mention quickly that Gabbie and I are currently funded by the Oak Foundation to conduct a multi-year research study together, investigating the access points and outcomes for students with learning differences within Ruler. And as part of this work, we're currently collecting and cataloging all the innovative formats for charters with diverse learners, and we would love to learn from you. We'd love to learn from your experience. It's what we were doing up until we were no longer allowed to be in our school building. And we'll follow up after the webinar with opportunities so that we can kind of partner in our learning together. There's such a tremendous amount of resources and bright spots there, and we want to elevate your work so that it can be shared to help and support other educators and other parents across the community. So let's take a minute to think about time. How are you responding to this challenge of loss of time, or while I say, you know, with the growth mindset here, making the most of the time that we currently all have together? So we'll take a minute to jump into the chat box. I'm seeing lots of notes about schedules, flexible schedules. Great. Yes, I just saw somebody fly through the chat there. Their most important goal, like what's the one goal for the day? We're going to work on that throughout the schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
I've been using that one in my family.
All right, should we move on to challenge 4?
Right, so the 4th challenge we want to talk about is this issue that the requirements are evolving and keep changing and we can't keep up. Definitely hear you on this one. And I, in addition to working at EdTogether, I also teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And when I was teaching a class on emotion and learning and universal design, when this all happened, and I had a week to move my class to distance learning. And in that context, Harvard offered us actually some really good training about how to think about moving to distance learning. And the thing that really stuck with me from doing my planning was that they said, assume it will take twice as long to do anything. And that I think it's more than twice as long. And that not everything has to be face-to-face, that the live session is not the be all end all. And so really going through your materials and trying to think about, how to adjust how you're engaging with your students and what you ask them to do. So I tried to take that to heart. And I had to make choices in thinking about my class. I had to make choices about what to focus on, right? Because there isn't actually twice as much time to do the work. So I had to make choices about what I was going to focus on. I had to think about my students' strengths and challenges. I had to think about my options around implementation and the affordances and challenges of various approaches. And I had to crosswalk these factors to decide how to implement. And at the core of this is really advanced decision-making skills, right? I had to work to make constructive choices about my practice that's built around student needs, course requirements, the affordances and challenges of distance learning strategies available to me, of what was available to my students. The week that we came back, I asked everyone to tell me, or the week before, they were all in the classroom with me, where they were in the chat. I had students in Australia, China, California. It was like, I just was like shocked at the change. And they all were under different conditions. I had some students who were quarantined because they were crossing international borders and so on. So I really had to think about their current context of the pandemic and our various experiences and circumstances therein. Chris, you can move the slide along. And I bring that up to say that we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. I can't remember where I heard that. I can't claim that I came up with that, but I just think it's a really important thing to keep in mind. Even when we're all in the same town, we're not in the same boat. We're in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And so to me, this is the calculus of distance learning, the decision-making that's inherent to distance learning. It's not the same as face-to-face. There are trade-offs to consider, and everyone is engaged in this calculus, right? So states are providing guidance about what standards are most important to attend to. Just this week, Massachusetts put out guidance about power standards, which caused every single district in the state to have to rejigger the work that they were doing. Schools are working out how to implement IEPs that sometimes align to what the faculty and parents' understandings are and sometimes are not aligned. Parents are making choices about what to attend to and engage to around distance learning and balancing that with their own work schedules and also circumstances, with many parents being laid off and not being employed or being furloughed or being essential workers, having to go outside the home or being ill. And students are making choices in that context as well. And I just want to say that this calculus was always the case. It's just more obvious now, right? All of these requirements, all these different pressures that are put on us to have to make, value judgments about what we're going to focus on. But I think the key is to keep your consideration of the well-being of your students at the center of the storm. And to do it in collaboration and in relationship to the families and students that you serve. And that means having very, frank and supportive conversations with them about the decisions that they're making, right? Because if you're making decisions that aren't aligned to and supportive of the decisions that they're making, you're just going to pass each other in the night. So really using those relational skills, even building a relationship in this context, making it deeper and stronger in order to make decisions together, I think is really important. You know your students, families know their children, students know themselves. You are literally the point of connection between student services and policies. You are it. And so the evolving requirements don't change the fact that you are that pivot point. And what we would suggest is that decision-making is a social emotional skill, and that you should orient your thinking squarely in the best interest of your student, and plan and the plans, assignments, and requirements can evolve around that. It's a work in progress. It's going to change. And so having that growth mindset in decision making in this calculus of distance learning is critically important. At the end of the day, what we can control is that how we make the most of our time together is in the best interest of our students. So we just encourage you to have that anchor. And I wanted to give you one more example from our case studies. It's not published yet, but it will be next week. A teacher who works in a substantially separate classroom with students with substantial needs in Arizona is writing a case study about how when he began his work along with other special educators that work in his classroom, they had started out thinking that they were going to really lean heavy on Zoom classroom distance live learning, and it was not working. He was super frustrated. I've seen some of you in the chat talk about this. And so they moved to small group sessions, and one day he had a student, two of the students didn't show, these are high school students, and one was there, and he was shocked about how engaging and how much traction he got with that one student. So he literally changed the way he was doing it so that Mondays are his community day where he's working with his students through group and collaborative work. And then the rest of the week, he's meeting one-on-one with students each day. And then they have asynchronous work. And that's been going much better. In fact, he's had several students who have been transformed in terms of their relationship to the work. And he's been able to engage with them much more deeply than even he was able to in the live classroom setting. And so I asked him, what are you going to do when you get back to school? And he was like, I don't know, but I'm going to do something different because I'm learning a lot about how much that one-to-one really matters to my kids. So I think that's just an example, and wouldn't work for everyone, right? Because some teachers have kids at home. Some teachers, their class load is too heavy to do that kind of strategy. But I have been encouraging the teachers I work with to think about that one-to-one option and how they can integrate it in different ways in their approach. But it's this decision-making process and trying to like enter into it, understanding that it's a process and a skill and a relational piece that you have to work on with your families and the kids that you're intending to serve. So requirements, how are you responding to this challenge? Drop your thoughts into the chat. We'd like to see your ideas. Yeah, I see someone was noting that students with school phobia, school anxiety, I'm definitely seeing that too. In fact, I have a teacher that I've been working with who has a student who was a selective mute before and is now doing much better, does not use the video, but uses the audio for joint class sessions, and is now communicating in a limited way, but communicating verbally with her teachers in a way that she hadn't before. So there's definitely interesting things happening. Yeah, just rolling with it. You kind of have to roll with it, but build that into your decision-making process, like understanding that it's a process and being flexible and understanding you can grow in it as you move along.
Absolutely, certainly a process. I'm getting a notification that I'm having some audio issues. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me. That was chiming in there. Gabbie, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Chris.
Okay, all right, awesome.
You're good on my end too, Chris.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, my screen is frozen, but I think we're still moving along. I can no longer see the chat though. I do hear you though. It's definitely an evolution and needing to be very flexible about how we are, you know, how we're thinking about their access, how we're thinking about the requirements, and how we're making most of the time. And as I mentioned before, I have 4 children, and I'm actually having my 2 middles, who are 5 and 6, support in the educational experiences of my 7-year-old who has significant needs. in order to kind of help and bridge their learning together as well. And so it's been really interesting to see that on like the parent side of how I can engage with my son's teachers to help to kind of promote novel learning experiences for all three of my children. Has the screen progressed?
Yes.
Okay. So as we suggested today, the key to healthy emotion regulation through this time is for us to anchor ourselves first on what we can control. And from that anchor, we want to leverage emotional intelligence to work through these areas effectively, and that requires us to do that together. And so we have a tremendous opportunity here to shift into solution-oriented conversations for our students and ourselves during the pandemic. And we get to work together to affect the change for what these services, what accessibility, what time, and what requirements look like for all of our students here after the pandemic.
Great. Chris, thank you. And Chris and Gabbie, thank you so much for sharing your insights on this topic. We have quite a few great questions that have come through from our audience. One of the questions, after many weeks already immersed in remote learning, is it too late to address or articulate the EI Charter?
Chris, you're muted.
Still
Linda,
muted. Oh, I'll unmute.
Okay. How
There
about
you
now?
go.
There.
Sorry about that, guys. I've lost all control of my screen here. Gotta love technology. So is it too late to start? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's never too late. You can start today. You can start tomorrow. So just focusing on how you want to feel in this learning environment and taking it as an opportunity and a jumping off point for all learning thereafter. And you may even want to think about being able to take your experiences of how you felt prior to setting up that charter and bring that into the conversation. Mm-hmm. So if you felt like you were you're not heard or felt frustrated or overwhelmed, bring those into the conversation, depending upon your student's level and needs and the parents or caregivers you're able to engage with. But it's really important that it's a team, that everyone's doing that together.
Great, thank you. Since accessibility to technology and use is an equity issue, what can be ways that we can stress well-being for students and their families while distant from school? Will the loss in academic time be less of an issue if students are having their mental health needs met?
So I only heard part of the question. But I think we were talking about, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. The focusing on the emotional health and well-being first as the foundation, right, for all learning thereafter. And so if we think about what we know from emotion science and learning, we need to attend to our emotions and be regulated in order for us to be able to hear the really tremendous lesson that and great content and great curriculum that is being shared with us. And so if we aren't well within first, we're not able to access our learning centers to be able to make meaning of that instruction. And so it's always important to attend to your emotional health first and understand where you're at in that space before moving forward, and especially during the pandemic. Now, is that to say that like all academic instruction should stop at this time? Absolutely not. I'm not saying that. Please do not like misquote that. But rather we need to think about and be relative to what are we available to learn during this time and what are kind of those core access points and kind of core areas within the content that are important for each particular student's ability to sustain during this time and perhaps not slip, as well as if there's opportunity for them to be able to grow during this time and where can you scaffold. And that's going to look differently across students within your classes and across classrooms within a school. That should not be a one size fits all. set a requirement. And I do believe that educators are in the prime place right now to make the judgment call on what that should look like for each one of their learners.
I think sometimes I've seen too where these things cross with each other explicitly, sometimes unexpectedly. So one of the teachers I'm working with in New York, she, around the case study project, she was mentioning that usually she gets to this time of the year and they have a poetry unit. It feels really dry. She has difficulty getting students engaged. And these are kids who are like sort of at the center of the pandemic and in the United States, right in New York. So there's been a lot of loss and grief, and so she wasn't really looking forward to doing this unit. But as it turned out, it was incredibly moving and engaging. And what she's ended up doing with the support of social work support in her school and counseling support is using the poetry unit as a space where students are able to grieve and be present in their feelings together, which surprised her, but she sort of took that opportunity to use that space, and it's been good.
I think we're getting, from what I'm seeing right now, the chat has reappeared. We're getting a lot of people responding to that as well, of thinking about how they can lean in to emotion in their teaching explicitly as well during this time, of bringing it out. And poetry, with it being, what is this, Poetry Month right now?
Poetry Month, yeah, that's
Poetry Month. I know that my kids are all doing it as well, right? In leaning into that as an opportunity to label how we're feeling and think about how we're expressing those feelings.
Thank you, Chris and Gabbie. It looks like we're running out of time. There were a lot of really great questions throughout the presentation in the chat box and in the Q&A. We're going to look through those questions and take the time to consolidate them, and we'll follow up in the coming weeks with responses. I would like to thank Chris Cipriano and Gabbie Schlichtmann again for sharing this content with us. Please note that a recording of the webinar will be sent out to all registrants within 2 business days. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.